Hello, Python coders and coders in general today. So, I was on the phone with an old friend of mine. We've been friends for, I want to say, like 20 years now. And we worked at the same company together. We had some interesting coworkers. But he was asking me, who did I think was the worst coworker I've ever had? And I was thinking back, and there's been some interesting coworkers, but in all honesty, I think the worst individual that I ever worked with was, and for the purposes of discussion here, we're going to call him Jim. Jim was an enigma wrapped in a riddle. I don't think anybody ever figured this guy out. So, in 2007, I moved across the country to work at a manufacturing plant. And the first 2 weeks that I was there, I had met everyone. And I met Jim. And he didn't really seem like any different than anyone else. A few weeks in, though, you could kind of tell he was a little bit of an eccentric, which I kind of am, so I didn't really have a problem with that. But then the guy that I was replacing left after those first 2 weeks, and I was on my own. A couple of my colleagues, we went to lunch in the cafeteria, and we're sitting there talking, and they said, "Listen, we're just going to be very upfront with you. Jim is nuts. He is absolutely crazy." Now, when you hear that kind of thing, you kind of take it with a grain of salt because, well, maybe they've had a bad experience with him in the past. Maybe it's just personality clash. So I don't really take that sort of thing at face value. I try my best to make up my own mind. And the first story that they told me about Jim was when they were interviewing. Now, when you interview at companies, and especially in information technology, they will tend to go back and check your references. You provide them with a few references. In this case, it was 3, and they give him a call. Now, the guy that was telling me this was the guy that actually called Jim's references. The first red flag should have been that 2 of Jim's references wouldn't even talk about him. So all they would say is no comment, and they very politely ended the conversation. So, in my opinion, that should have been flag number 1, that there's something a little different here. The third guy that they talked to said the funniest thing that I have ever heard in a reference request in my life. All the guy would say is, "Well, I can tell you he makes a mean bowl of chili." And that was all the guy would say. Ended the conversation. Also found out that the reason that we were not allowed to go to conferences was because of Jim. Apparently a few years ago, before I started working there, Jim and another coworker went off to a coding conference. We used a code generation tool, and they put on a conference every year. When they were asked about it, when they got back, the guy that went with him said, "Well, what's really funny is that I saw him in the first session, and then I never saw him the rest of the trip. I don't know where he went." Apparently, and Jim did this frequently, he would brag about some of the things that he did, and he told another person that works there, not in our department, but that he spent a lot of the time in the hotel hot tub. Our manager, he was an IT supervisor, he caught wind of this and was furious. So for years, we were not allowed to go to conferences. In fact, the one conference that I went to was the same conference, just a different year. Our supervisor came with us. just to make sure that we were going to the sessions. So I was never very happy about that, but I found out that he was the reason why we had to start doing that. After those first 2 weeks, I remember I went grocery shopping. I was still living where the plant was. Outside of it, I was in temporary housing before I went into my own home. So I went to the grocery store. I think it was on like a Saturday or a Sunday. I know it was a weekend. I pull up and I park, and as I'm walking towards the entrance of the store, I walk right in front of Jim's car, and Jim is getting out of his car. So he sees me, so there's no possible way that I can avoid him. It's not like I saw him in the store and could kind of, duck and cover, but he comes up to me, and he had a very distinctive way of speaking, and he would bob his head up and down as he was talking to you. So he says, "Can I talk to you for a bit?" He never said, "Can I talk to you for a minute? Do you have a minute?" It was always, "Can I talk to you for a bit?" He did this to me many different times. So he says to me, "Can I talk to you for a bit?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." He says, "Well, I just want you to know, you probably heard a lot of bad things about me, and I just really want you to make up your own mind." And I was kind of stunned by this because I have never had a coworker come with such a big warning label. And then on top of it, that same coworker knows about his warning label. And he starts to try and tell me that I need to make up my own mind. And I'm like, "Jim, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it." But unfortunately, some of the things that he did would prove that he was a little bit on the, not all on the up and up. The reason that I classify Jim as the worst coworker I've ever had, and honestly the worst software developer I've ever met, wasn't because of an eccentricity that he had, but it was because he caused the single worst meltdown that I have seen from one developer. Now, I have been involved in projects, not directly, but indirectly, where the project has melted down. But in all of those other cases, it was a team. It was never just one individual who made a complete and total mess. I've been on a couple where there's been a few different developers make a mess, maybe a group of developers make a mess, but never just one. We had a homegrown purchasing system that was written in our code generation tool. And what needed to be done, this is years after I met Jim, by the way. I'll tell you some other stories as we go on here, but at this point in time, Jim, or what needed to happen was some of the tables inside this purchasing system needed to be expanded. We had some columns or fields that needed to be expanded, and I think we needed a couple of new tables as well. For the life of me, I cannot understand how Jim landed up with this project. He didn't have an excellent track record as it was, so why our supervisor let him even think about tackling this project is beyond me. But Jim comes into our staff meeting and he talks about the method that he wanted to do to accomplish this project. What he wanted to do was he wanted to take and leave the existing tables alone. He wanted to create another set of tables, and he wanted to fully populate those and then also maintain both tables at the same time for a period of time. I remember our senior developer who'd been there 20 years. He'd been there since the place had been built. He looked at him and he was like, "Are you crazy? There's no way we want to do it this way. Just do it the normal way. Just check out the tables, check out the objects, make your changes, do your compiles, see what blows up, fix it, the normal way that we would make major changes like that." Well, there's one personality trait of Jim that a lot of people didn't really take into account. And that is, Jim had the mentality, I don't even want to say of a 5-year-old child. He just had the mentality that you could not tell him the word no. So most people, when they're really, really young, I'm talking 3, 4 years old, you get told no. And in some cases, the child pushes the limit and you have to punish him. Now, but in Jim's case, I don't know what was happening when he was a child. But when Jim heard the word no, Jim went ahead and did it anyway. I don't know if Jim's parents let him get away with this. My parents, I would have been beaten. If my mother, or especially my dad, if he told me no and I went ahead and did it anyway, I was in a whole heap of trouble. Not for Jim. You could not tell Jim the word no. And this is going to come back later in this story, so stay tuned. So anyway, Jim, in secret, goes ahead and does this the way he wanted to do it. I don't remember how many months he worked on this, but then the project went into production, and the next morning all hell broke loose. You have to remember, a manufacturing plant buys a lot of stuff. A purchasing system is one of the most important systems that you can have in a facility like this. And for the first, I want to say 2 days, they couldn't do any purchasing at all. We had to put a couple of different people on to help Jim do the fixes. It's a long sordid tale. And it actually took about, after Jim left, it took about 8 months to fully fix the mess that he put us in. So, and if you were paying attention, you just heard me say that Jim left, and he did. He left, I forget how many months after that project. In fact, what we did, I don't know how this all worked out, but it was like he got pawned off to our sister division. So, yeah, that was one of the absolute worst. And then, I think maybe a week and a half after the meltdown, I've never seen this before or after either. Jim, my supervisor, and a couple of the individuals from purchasing, including the lead from purchasing, the supervisor, were sitting in my manager's office. And this one purchasing agent, she was a great lady. She is so mad, she is screaming at him across the table. So she's letting in on him, and I happened to walk by, but you could hear her all the way up and down the hallway. She let him have it. And, you know, I did have a conversation with my supervisor later on about this, and I was like, I hate to break this to you, but you're as much to blame as he is, because we told you, don't let him do it this way. And he went ahead and did it anyway. So what's the aftermath? Well, it took months to fix. Jim went to our sister division that was up the road. He didn't last there very long. And then he was booted out of there, and then he was out of a job. So the situation for him at this point is kind of weird, because now he's out of a job and he's got to figure out what is he going to do, because where we were located was pretty rural. So there's not a whole lot of demand for programmers in this area. And the other thing that made it more difficult was that Jim's wife, great lady by the way, she had a job at the plant. So, and she had a really good job. So they happened to have, or Jim had bought years ago, they had a house in Jacksonville, Florida. And they were renting it out for years, but their renters had recently left. So Jim's like, well, I've got this house in Jacksonville. The job market down there in Jacksonville is going to be a lot better than where I am now. The only stumbling block was his wife. She didn't want to go. Wasn't too long after this, Jim's house caught fire, and he had significant fire damage. Now, I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions. I'm not going to say what may or may not have happened. Everybody at work, though, was sort of raising their eyebrows. So I'll let you do your own thinking on that. But what eventually happened is they go to Florida. Now remember, I told you, you don't tell Jim no. Okay? After that, Jim bounced. He went from job to job to job to job to position. I unblocked him from LinkedIn fairly recently, and I found that in his career, he's actually been to 25 different companies. Now, I've been to 6. I've been doing this 23 years. I've worked at 6 companies. Jim had been doing this since, 93, I believe? He's been to 25 different companies. And a lot of those companies, he'd last about a year, and then he would bounce. Or, I have no idea, maybe they bounced him. It's impossible to tell from that. Where is Jim today? Well, Jim actually passed from illness a couple years ago, so he's actually no longer with us. Okay, so the big project meltdown was the biggest thing that labeled me one of the worst developers. But what about just general coworker? Well, he would do things that were very, very strange. One of the things that he did that I found to be fairly nefarious and really, really ticked me off was he, for some odd reason, got really big into C#. And he kept trying to convince our management that we should be doing more in C#. Well, we didn't need C#. So I don't understand where this was coming from. He decided that he was going to teach a C# class at the local community college. Okay, no problem. Well, what he did was he convinced several coworkers to sign up for the class. And then I found out that the company decided it was going to pay for it. I called the community college and found out that Jim was also being paid to teach. This infuriated me. And the reason that it infuriated me so much was our company controller for months had been going around telling us we can only spend money when it is absolutely necessary. So we're in kind of a dry spell, okay? And he's pounding into our heads, can't spend money, you can't spend money, you can't spend money unless it's absolutely necessary. So I got a little ticked off and I marched down to his office and walked in there and said, "Would you please explain to me where this class is absolutely necessary? You've been pounding into our heads for months that we're not supposed to be spending money. And this guy's teaching this class on something we don't even use. What is the benefit here? Aren't you supposed to be asking those questions?" And I think by the fire that was coming out of my mouth and my ears, I think he realized that I was about to go way, way over his head. And he's right. I had letters ready to go to the COO and CEO. So he knew he was in big trouble. Class got canceled. What they did was Jim taught his little C# class in our conference room. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. So he's thinking that he's going to get paid for teaching this class, and he can do it for free right at the plant. So why are we doing this? So anyway, that got canceled. The other thing that happened that was very strange about him, he knew I was not very happy with him when he left. I was angry about the mess he made, and I was also angry that he left in the middle of fixing it. I absolutely have a firm belief, if you make the mess, you clean up the mess. You can get help cleaning up the mess, but the initial mess is your responsibility. And here he disappears. So I worked at that company for another, I think it was another maybe a little over 2 years after he left. I moved several states away to work for a retail outfit. And I had been there, maybe a month or so. I can't remember exactly how long it was. I get a phone call at my desk. I didn't get too many phone calls, but I answer the phone, and here it's Jim on the other end of the line. And the first thing that's going through my mind is, number one, I don't want to talk to you. So I was like, Jim, what do you want? And he tried to start going into something, and I said, listen, I don't have time for this, and I hung up the phone. He kept calling, and he kept calling. I put my ringer down on the phone. He keeps calling and calling. So I asked the network engineer we had. She blocked his number. About 20 or 30 minutes later, phone starts ringing again. I pick it up. He's calling me on his cell phone. And he's yelling at me. He's like, why won't you talk to me? And I'm like, Jim, I don't want to talk to you. I've got things to do. To me, at this point, he's ancient history. I don't have time for this. I figured out later that where he must have been getting where I work from is LinkedIn. And at that particular time, if I remember correctly, LinkedIn did not have the ability for you to block people. So that's where he was looking me up. So we blocked his cell phone. I never heard from him. I didn't stay at this company very long. I was only there about a year. And I approached a friend of mine about working for the consulting company that he was working for. And I spent years there. But the irony of it is, I update my LinkedIn. And I hadn't been at the new place for a couple of months. And my boss sends me, or I think he called me actually. He calls me and he says, hey, this guy Jim, he said his last name, I'm not going to, but he said, this guy Jim is trying to get a hold of you. I'm like, why? And then that's when it dawned on me that he must be getting where I'm working from LinkedIn, because nobody that I know would be talking to him. So finally, LinkedIn lets you block people. So now at the end, the last 10 years, he had no idea where I was working. And I never had any contact with him after that point. There's also little strange things about him, made him a little bit more eccentric. One is, he used to talk to us about this patent that he had. And I looked it up at one point. He does have a U.S. patent. The ironic part about it, though, is he patented a different way of playing a board game. I'm not going to tell you which one, but when I did some research into this, it looks like there was a gentleman in the 19th century who actually invented this version, but apparently never patented it. So Jim figured out, well, he didn't patent it. This is my theory. He didn't patent it, so I'm going to patent it. So yeah, he does have a patent out there, but it's from an idea from 200, almost 200 years ago. The other thing that he did that he actually bragged about, which is what got him into trouble again, was he volunteered to do the movie reviews for the local newspaper. And apparently he did a couple movie reviews and then got tired of doing them. So instead of quitting, what he did was he started taking the New York Times movie reviews and submitting them to the local newspaper. Again, he bragged about this to somebody, I don't know who, and the newspaper caught him. And so, yeah, that ended his literary career. He was not allowed to do any more movie reviews. he had a very interesting way of using his keyboard. He was a two-finger typer, so he wasn't like a full QWERTY keyboard user like I am. And he would pound on his keyboards when he was typing. So you almost wanted to take the keyboard and smash it over his head because he was so loud. The list of things that I could tell you about the guy, like one time he sat down in our staff meeting, decided it was too hot, so he had a hoodie on. He just takes his hoodie off. So now he's standing there in the middle of the conference room shirtless, goes to his office and gets a t-shirt. And instead of changing into his t-shirt in the office, he changes into it in the conference room. He used to do things like complain that the company doesn't buy us enough lunches. So he'd be like, well, can we make this into a lunch and learn? Where you kind of take your lunch hour and you learn new skills or new techniques or something, and you eat. Personally, I think it's a pain in the butt. I want to spend my lunch hour eating, socializing, or by myself. I don't want to do these lunch and learns. But he was always pushing for that. He's like, well, the company can pay for our lunches and blah blah blah. I'm like, Jim, the company pays for all of our lunches. I hate to break this to you, but this is the only source of income I have. So the company's buying all my lunches. Just trying to think if there were other things about him. He did have a tendency to not be able to let things go. So if you said something to him that he interpreted in a bad way, he would not let it go. He was also very desperate to be liked. And I think part of that was the personality undoing was just, I absolutely need to be liked by everybody. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there's going to be people out there that are not going to like you. It's not that big of a deal. I've had coworkers that don't like me, but that doesn't mean that I don't treat them poorly. I mean, they just might not like me as a person. For him, that was a death sentence. You had to like him. And anyway, I could, if I sat down here and I thought about the things that guy did over what was I there with him, 3 years? If I sat there and talked about those things, here was a funny one. I just thought of this. We were interviewing another developer, and Jim came into the room, and I remember this guy distinctly because unfortunately he had a leg injury, so he was in a cast. And Jim came in the room, walked up to the guy. So the guy extends his hand, and Jim reaches out and says, "Hey, I'm Jim, D7I." And the guy looked at him, and the guy looked at us, and I'm sitting there going, you gotta be kidding me. So he said, "I'm Jim, D7I." So the guy's like, "What is D7I?" Well, D7I was one of the applications that Jim supported interfacing to. And so we had to tell the guy, no, it's not a title. No, he's not in the Secret Service or something. No, this is just one of the apps that he supports. But just unusual to walk into a room and sit down and go, Jim, D7I. He was a hoot. There are some other stories. The funniest story that I personally experienced with him. Jim and his wife. If you met his wife without him in the picture, you would think she was the nicest, most cordial individual you'd ever meet. And she was. She was always smiling. She was always happy. Fun to be around. But her and Jim fought like cats and dogs. I couldn't believe it. You completely different personality when she was around him. How they stayed married is beyond me. I was working later one evening, so it was right around 7 o'clock. I remember thinking that I really should be getting home, and the phone rang in Jim's office. Now, Jim's office at that point was right next door to mine. And the phone rings. Now, Jim had a very nasty habit of putting his calls on speakerphone. So I hear the phone ring. I hear him pick it up. And he was trying to say hello, but before the words could come out of his mouth, his wife is screaming at him, "Where's my toothbrush, you goddamn butthole?" That's what she yelled at him. Not quietly either. And then Jim yelled, "You're on speakerphone." And she was like, "I don't get..." And then I heard the phone click. He picks up the phone, and they start yelling at each other back and forth over the phone. And I heard him say, "He's got to tell everybody you called me a butthole." Well, that's kind of true. Well, I guess now I've told the world your wife called you a butthole. The amount of stories like that I could tell you about him are unbelievable. I will give him credit. The reference that we called years ago, yes, he does make a mean bowl of chili. We had a chili cook-off contest every year. He never won that I know of, but his chili was always really good. Terrible developer, caused a giant meltdown, was almost impossible to work with, wouldn't listen to anybody. The list stacked up against this poor guy is unbelievable. It also reminded me of my first full-time job outside of college. I had moved across the country, which I've done a couple times, and when I first started working here, there were two people that were supporting our HPUX environment. And we ran an Informix database, and we supported PeopleSoft, which was HR and financials. The gentleman that was supporting this decided that he was going to retire. So he transitioned everything he was doing to a lady that we'll call Phyllis. So Phyllis is now in charge of the whole environment by herself. And they decide not to hire another person. What they'll do is they'll take somebody like myself and train me to be a backup for her. And that was fine. I didn't mind learning HPUX. Well, it wasn't too long after that the one guy retired that we started having some backup problems. And this went on for weeks. Might have even been a couple of months. I remember I got pulled into some discussions with HP about it. It went on for a long period of time. And we had had a manager change. So we were now reporting to a new manager. And he didn't really have a lot of tolerance for baloney. The previous guy we were working for, you could buffalo him if you were really good. But not this new guy. You couldn't baloney him into anything. And I remember I'm sitting at my desk in my cube, and she got called into his office. She was gone for about a half an hour, maybe 20 minutes, and she came out of his office, and I have never seen anything like this, before or after. She came out of his office just screaming. She runs down the hallway. Tears are coming down her face. She grabs the phone and she calls her husband and she says, "I'm coming home. I'm done. I've had it with this crap." So apparently her husband worked in the financial areas somehow, and he was making quite a bit of money, so she didn't really need to work. And she left. That was the end of her. I've never seen a meltdown by a person like that before or after that. She just got up and was screaming. We all looked up. We were like, "What's going on?" She came running down that hallway, and she's like, "I'm out of here." She packed her stuff and went home. So we had no HPUX support for a couple of weeks, and the backup problems were still happening. The next guy was fairly inexperienced. He was one of our store support people, but he caught on pretty quickly, and I remember I gave him a lot of help. So anyway, that's my coworker horror stories. I do have some more, but they're not as exciting as those two. And other than that, I hope you guys are doing really, really well. and happy coding.